So, thank you very much for inviting me here to Tel Aviv. I'm pleased to be here. I'm just going to switch on my iPhone to check that I don't go over my 20 minutes. And you'll be pleased to know that one of the 20 editions of DarkMarket around the world is a Hebrew edition, which is going to be published in September by the legendary publishing house Books in the Attics. Now, when I came to writing about cybersecurity and cybercrime for a general audience, I was faced with a tremendous problem, because for the great majority of humanity, unlike people here in this room, computers and computer security are witlessly boring subjects. So before I started writing the book, DarkMarket, I thought I'd do a bit of research, and I started by reading the majestic Millennium Trilogy by Stieg Larsson, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and all that sort of stuff. And when I discussed the book with friends, I was struck how they all remarked that it was amazing what the heroine, Elizabeth Salander, could do with computers. So I went through the book and I saw that actually computers make up less than 1% of the book. And then it hit me. It wasn't the computers that people were interested in, it was Elizabeth Salander herself. So I realized that if I wanted to write a successful book about computer security, then which would be read by people other than geeks, then the one thing I needed to do, paradoxically, was to avoid writing about computers. Instead, I should write about the people behind them. We've got some real-world problems now. And it makes a change from virtual problems, I can tell you. Anyway, since then, since I started doing that, I have met and interviewed for hours and hours on end many people who are just like Elizabeth Salander, except there is one exception, because they were all men. And that is because 95% of hackers are male. And although I tried to find a female hacker, I failed. So they turned out all to be fascinating characters, and I want to present you today with some of the insights that I've gained about what hackers can do, who they are, and what their motivation is as well. Now, at the start of my research, I was only dimly aware of the wisdom of the Chinese philosopher and military strategist from the 3rd century BC, Sun Tzu. But a few interviews with people in IT security put me straight on that subject. Have you noticed how many people in IT, particularly in America, quote Sun Tzu? See, but these days, you know, it's not only IT security who worship at this particular altar. Here is one of Sun Tzu's most recent acolytes. And I was thinking that maybe the University of Tel Aviv might like to invite Paris Hilton next year to share her thoughts on Sun Tzu's seminal tome, The Art of War. Now, but what interests me is the essence of Sun Tzu's message. And if we distill it, it reads quite simply, know your enemy. Now, that's a very simple idea, isn't it? But for all of the affection for Sun Tzu in the cybersecurity community, I cannot help but wonder whether anyone is paying attention to this central message. Who is the enemy? What do we really know about the hackers engaged in bad stuff? Is there a working taxonomy of them? Who are the masterminds behind the attacks? Is it suave social engineers? Is it highly skilled hackers? Or is it psychopathic characters who combine both talents? Is there an abnormally high incidence of Asperger's and other spectrum-related disorders among hackers? And if there is, What does it mean? Have traditional organized crime syndicates moved into cyber? If so, why and how? What's their relationship to the existing underground community in cyber? And if the ability to deploy violence is central to the success of traditional organized criminal groups, is there an equivalent criminal enforcement strategy emerging in cyberspace? Now, of course, there are plenty of anecdotal opinions about this, about the nature of hackers and the web underground, but entertaining and occasionally insightful though they may be, as analytical tools, they don't quite work. But the security industry is obsessed by analytical tools in the digital sphere. I want to know what is going on in the human sphere. And this is very important. If we look at some of the threats that have been discussed this morning, for example, the majority of them involve primarily the practice of social engineering. That is, criminals or other types persuading people to do things with their computers which are not in their interest. That has nothing to do with digital issues. That is a human issue. And of course, hackers are very clever people, and they learnt very quickly that the quickest way to persuade somebody to do something which is not in their interests is the promise of sex. So you all remember, of course, the great I Love You virus, which was one of the first viruses that spread incredibly fast around the world. Now, I was very fortunate because the first person that I received the I Love You virus from in an email, I love you, was my ex-wife. And she harbored all sorts of emotions towards me at the time, but love was definitely not amongst them. So as soon as I saw I love you from her, no, surely not. So I was able to throw it straight away into the trash can and spare myself a very nasty infection. But that's just a simple example. We are not doing enough research into how these people are thinking in terms of manipulating human psychology. But research is made very challenging by the lack of consensus when it comes to definitions. The term hacker, for example, has undergone a remarkable transformation over the past 20 years, from one that was largely, even unambiguously positive, to one that is now overwhelmingly negative. And yet the essential activity of hackers, exploring computers and their network systems and establishing vulnerabilities, has not changed. Researchers tend to argue that it's chiefly law enforcement and the media that have repositioned hackers and hacking in this way. The mass media present a big problem here. They now use the label hacker for anyone involved in crime or espionage that is cyber or telecoms related. So if you take the Murdoch scandals at the News of the World and elsewhere, this is habitually referred to in the British press as phone hacking. Certainly the journalists involved exceeded their authorized access to a system, but they did so by bribing police or insiders at service providers to give them PIN numbers of the voicemail boxes of celebrities. Now you can see why it's referred to as hacking, but no computing skills are involved. So we have a problem with definition. Putting that aside, let me talk about those people who all of us here would understand to be hackers, people with very advanced computer skills. Now, this is a new type of person, and the criminal justice system hasn't really come to terms with them yet. So let's hear what some of these hackers have to say. The following quotes all come from interviews that I have conducted with former or currently active cyber criminals. I'm waiting for the sound, but the sound's not coming. And I think that's a central part. There we are.
So basically I can send a message from anybody's cell phone anywhere in the world to anybody else's and I write what I want. I've had a lot of fun with it.
The great majority of those carders who are arrested are either young, naive, or careless. As far as I know, none of the powerful syndicates selling dumps in bulk like the Russian group SMA have ever been detected or arrested. My sense is the feds don't even know who they are.
The most basic rule, as far as I am concerned, is never, ever, touch American cards. It is not because American cards are difficult. No chip and pin means that they are the easiest in the world. It is because if you do American cards, then you are under the jurisdiction of the FBI and the Secret Service. Canadian and European police I can handle, but I prefer to stay away from the feds.
We were not born yesterday. We are serious operators. We have a digital and we have a human intelligence capacity. The FBI and soccer may be watching us, but we are watching them in return. We anticipate and we analyze all their serious moves.
This is something I want to highlight. The counterintelligence capacity of the hacking community is, in my experience, more advanced than people imagine. They really are no pushovers. They have contacts inside many law enforcement agencies. They are able to exploit competitive divisions between agencies engaged in cyber investigations. The recent case of Anonymous intercepting a recording of a conference call consultation between FBI field officers and the Metropolitan Police Cyber Division demonstrated that carelessness is not restricted to young cadres, but to cops as well. And in the past month, we have evidence from a confidential document of the UK's Serious Organised Crime Agency, SOCA, which was leaked in Britain, that private investigators working for organised criminal syndicates employed hackers to successfully breach the networked systems of 3 of Britain's police forces. How serious this is, but it's worth highlighting that this is further evidence that traditional organised crime groups are beginning to appreciate the value of a cyber capacity. As always happens in a recession, established syndicates turn to fraud after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, as their commodity-based activities, drugs, trafficking of women for sexual purposes and so on, suffered a downturn. On this occasion, however, when they turned to fraud, they discovered that the internet was transforming the scale and nature of fraud. Elsewhere, the Mexican cartels now possess a sophisticated digital backbone which expedites their business, shifting cocaine into the United States from South America, but also in order to monitor and assess the capacity of their domestic opponents. Bloggers who have sought to expose their criminal activities have been tracked down via their IP addresses, and 4 of them were murdered in Laredo last November. The use of violence in cyber-assisted crimes is still rare, but as the surveillance capacity of criminals develop in the ways indicated above, the incidence of violence is likely to increase. Now, trying to ascertain the actual cost of cybercrime is quite simply impossible. I was thinking about this in terms of trying to understand how much money are these people responsible for and how we're responding to it. But I kept coming up against the problem that with no legal obligation to report breaches, our picture will always be horribly incomplete about the damage which cybercrime inflicts. This, of course, doesn't stop people from making dramatic claims all the time excuse me, about how much we lose to cyber malfeasance every year. The White House, for example, tells us it's $1 trillion. But we're just guessing. It might be more, it might be less. So I thought I'd look at this problem from the opposite perspective. How much are we actually spending on cybersecurity every year? And what are we spending it on? To start with, let's have a look and see how much the Western world is paying. Here are the most accurate statistics that I've been able to garner, although it's not an easy sector to research. The London-based business consultant Vision Gain has estimated that Western governments will have spent $37.9 billion on telecommunications and cybersecurity in 2011. Then there is the private sector. Gartner calculates that for 2011, the total spend on both software and services is an eye-watering $51.4 billion. So the US, Western Europe and Japan makes up 3/4 of that figure. So the current total cost to governments and industry is just shy of $90 billion. But this does not include China and Russia. I think we can safely guess that the spend there will top around $10 billion. So there we have it. This is roughly how much the industry is worth every year, $100 billion. Oh, and the estimated compound annual growth rate will fluctuate between 7 and 8% in the US, this of course while we're in a recession, Western Europe and Japan, which means that the cybersecurity industry is bucking the economic crisis, so most of you here have chosen the right business to go into. In the emerging markets, this compound annual growth rate is calculated as high as 15%, so get down to South America quickly. This is a lot of money, but almost all of it is going on high-end technical solutions to cybersecurity. The industry is interested in shifting product. That's their job. Research and development budgets are channeled into product development. Given the logic of that business, the industry simply doesn't care and isn't interested in devoting time or money into getting to know the enemy. So, are governments demonstrating any interest in the opponent? Well, some governments are, but not necessarily in the way that you imagine. And here we reach an interesting point where cybercrime, cyber espionage, and cyber warfare intersect. When I was researching my book, DarkMarket, I first of all investigated the carding website which changed the face of cybercrime. This was called Carder Planet. Carder Planet was founded in Odessa just after the turn of the millennium. Carder Planet introduced an escrow system which enabled criminals to overcome the primary challenge facing them all. How can I trust the person I'm doing business with when I know he's a criminal and is therefore intrinsically untrustworthy? But the escrow system was so joyously successful as a venture that Carder Planet's family organized the first ever worldwide international Carders Conference, which took place in May and June of 2001 in Odessa. Carders came from all over the world and held plenary discussions in the Hotel Odessa and breakout sessions in various restaurants around town, discussing subjects like how can we better exploit the smaller cards like diners and JCB. Now, I succeeded in tracking down the press release from the Worldwide International Carders Conference, and its first item on it is particularly interesting in my opinion. Once again, it says the critical issue of the inadmissibility of any action in relation to the billing system, banks, or other financial institution in the Commonwealth of Independent States, especially Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, was raised. Furthermore, the family will deal ruthlessly with any Carder found engaging in such activity. So I then spoke to one of the founder members of Carder Planet and I asked him what that was all about. And he told me that the deal with the SBU in Ukraine and with the FSB in Russia was explicit. Cadres and other cyber criminals were free to attack anyone they liked in Western Europe and the United States, but woe betide anyone who launched an assault on an institution in Russia. The second part of the deal was also clear. If Russia required hacking capacity for purposes of national security, then the criminal hacking community would be expected to make its contribution. And in the attacks on Estonia and Georgia in 2008 and 2007-2008 respectively, that's exactly what they did. The Chinese government also mobilizes its hacking community for specific political ends. And now that David Sanger has revealed that the US and Israel were behind Stuxnet, we have finally entered a world in which states are now willing and able to deploy malware on behalf of their national security interests outside of any regulatory framework. This is only likely to proliferate as the chances of Russia, China and the US reaching agreement on a global framework is very unlikely indeed. So clearly large sums are being devoted to military and espionage. But elsewhere I would argue that governments are struggling to meet the enormity of the challenge in cyber. They are hampered by bureaucratic procedure and they are strapped for cash. And research into the human agents behind the threat is way down the priority list if it exists at all. So apart from trying to introduce best practice and basic cybersecurity techniques in state institutions, governments driven by policies of austerity are increasingly relying on ever more draconian penalties to deter those involved in cybercrime, cyber-industrial espionage and cyber warfare. So this has nothing to do with knowing your opponent. It's instead focused on investigating, arresting and prosecuting those who are, in the terminology of the US Cyber Fraud and Abuse Act, exceeding their authorized access. And at this point, I'm going to have to close down because, of course, as always in these things, I overrun. But I do wish to stress that if we are going to make headway from now on with the issue of cybercrime and cybersecurity, we can no longer leave it up just to law enforcement officers and to technical specialists. This is now something that requires behaviorologists, criminologists, psychologists, anthropologists, lawyers, journalists, all sorts of people to understand. And to that end, I hope I'm going to succeed in setting up a project with Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, which is designed specifically to research the community of hackers around the world, but also to engage with them, because it's my conviction that understanding and working with hackers is actually the key to solving the human problem behind this extremely significant major technological issue of our age. Thanks very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, Misha. This was very interesting. And I must say that one thing that you said made me thinking. We have also a cyber intelligence unit, and we also work with SOCA, and due to our findings, we were arrested. And I thought about it. There was no women that was actually we found as a hacker. And I think that maybe the problem is that probably the women hackers are doing a better job, so nobody can find them. Okay. So I'm very happy to invite